My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful entrepreneur, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. At my brother Jamal's wedding, he made me sit on a folding metal chair right next to the restroom, while even distant relatives were given proper seats. Humiliated, I quietly walked out. 15 minutes later, my brother turned pale and everyone finally realized why. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and yet I was never good enough. The golden child was always my older brother Jamal. Whatever Jamal did was celebrated while my accomplishments were treated as basic expectations or entirely ignored. When I eventually dropped out of college to start my own business, my mother acted as if I had committed a crime against the family legacy. They branded me a failure, a caterer who just served food, completely oblivious to the real estate and event management empire I was quietly building. I let them believe what they wanted. It was easier that way. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity they would display on the day of Jamal's wedding. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the grand bridal suite of the city's most exclusive venue. I had chosen a tasteful, tailored emerald green silk dress. It was elegant, but understated, intentionally selected, so I would not draw any attention away from the bride. The suite was a whirlwind of frantic energy. Hairstylists and makeup artists buzzed around, carrying cans of hairspray and expensive cosmetic palettes. Bottles of imported champagne sat in silver ice buckets on glass tables. The air smelled heavily of floral perfume and anxiety. Sitting in the center of it all was my sister-in-law, Tiffany. Tiffany was 32 years old and a notorious social climber. She was obsessed with her curated online image, constantly checking her reflection and snapping photos for her followers. She wanted everyone to believe she had married into immense generational wealth. When she finally noticed me standing near the doorway, her fake camera-ready smile instantly vanished. She handed her champagne flute to a bridesmaid, marched across the plush carpet, and grabbed something from a garment bag hanging on the door. Without a word of greeting, she tossed a balled-up piece of fabric directly at my chest. I caught the fabric instinctively. I unfolded it, my brow furrowing in confusion. It was a wrinkled, cheap black polyester catering uniform, complete with a dark gray apron. I looked up at Tiffany, waiting for an explanation. She crossed her arms, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against her silk robe. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Since you just serve food for a living, you might as well make yourself useful today," she sneered, her voice carrying across the quieted room. "Go out there and bust the cocktail tables before the guests arrive. I do not need you ruining my aesthetic in the background of my professional photographs." The entire room fell dead silent. The makeup brushes stopped moving. The bridesmaids exchanged wide-eyed glances. I stood there feeling the rough polyester scratch against my hands, trying to process the level of disrespect. Tiffany was not joking. She genuinely expected me, the groom's sister, to work as a busgirl at her wedding simply because she felt I was beneath her social standing. I took a deep breath, preparing to politely but firmly decline her absurd demand. But before I could speak a single word, my mother Elaine stepped out from the adjoining dressing room. My mother looked immaculate in her custom-tailored navy blue dress, a matching fascinator perched perfectly on her head. I felt a brief flicker of hope, assuming she would reprimand Tiffany for such a wildly inappropriate request. Instead, Elaine walked over and stood shoulder to shoulder with Tiffany, forming the same toxic alliance I had faced my entire life. My mother reached out and adjusted her fascinator, refusing to even make eye contact with me. Do not start drama today, Charmaine, my mother warned, her tone dripping with condescension. Just put the apron on and do as Tiffany asks. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Mom, I am a guest at my brother's wedding, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I am not putting on a catering uniform to clear dirty glasses. Elaine finally looked at me, her eyes narrowing with that familiar look of profound disappointment. Jamal is extremely stressed right now, she snapped. Your brother is a senior financial director, Charmaine. He paid $250,000 for this wedding. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the hired help would not hear, though her words were designed to cause maximum damage. You dropped out of college, Elaine hissed. You know you do not fit in with his high society friends or Tiffany's sorority sisters. You are going to stick out like a sore thumb in that dress. If you put the uniform on, you can blend in with the staff. You will actually be contributing something of value to the family for once instead of just being an embarrassment. The sheer cruelty of her words hung in the air. This was the layered escalation of emotional abuse I had endured for 35 years. They always knew exactly how to isolate me, how to make me feel small, and how to protect Jamal's inflated ego at all costs. Jamal was a financial director who liked to play the role of a wealthy mogul, and my mother was his most devoted enabler. They needed someone to look down on to feel superior, and I was their chosen target. But what none of them knew was that I was no longer the defenseless girl sitting in that pale blue bedroom in Fairfield. I looked down at the cheap black uniform in my hands. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent building my own life, the sleepless nights I had dedicated to creating my own success from the ground up, all while they mocked me for working in the service industry. I thought about the massive secret I was holding, a secret that would soon shatter their entire world of illusions. The urge to yell to defend myself, to throw my bank account balances in their faces, was incredibly strong. But women who truly hold power do not need to scream to be heard. I looked back up at Tiffany, who was wearing a smug, victorious grin. Then I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me, fully expecting me to bow my head and submit to her authority, just like I had done when I was a child. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Slowly, I let go of the black fabric. The wrinkled catering uniform fell to the plush carpet, landing right in between my mother's expensive designer heels. Tiffany gasped, her hand flying to her chest in mock outrage. Elaine opened her mouth to scold me, but I did not give her the chance. I gave them both a slow, freezing cold smile, a smile that contained no sadness, no submission, and absolutely no fear. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how this day was going to end. I am going to find my seat now, I said softly, my voice perfectly calm and composed. Do try not to ruin your own makeup before the photos, Tiffany. Without another word, I turned my back on them. I walked out of the chaotic bridal suite, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind me, cutting off Tiffany's indignant shrieks and my mother's angry demands. I smoothed down the fabric of my emerald green silk dress and began walking down the long carpeted hallway toward the grand ballroom. I had won the first battle by refusing to play their game. But I knew the real war was just beginning. They wanted to treat me like the help, but they had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with. The heavy oak doors to the grand ballroom stood wide open, welcoming the city's self-proclaimed elite. I walked through the threshold and was immediately enveloped by the breathtaking opulence of the space. This was Lumina Estates, the most exclusive and highly sought-after luxury venue in the entire metropolitan area. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the soaring vaulted ceilings, casting a warm and golden glow over the immaculate white marble floors. Every single table in the massive room was draped in imported silk linens and adorned with towering, elaborate centerpieces made of rare white orchids. The lighting was perfectly calibrated to make the crystal stemware sparkle under the ambient glow. I knew exactly how much those orchids cost, and I knew exactly how much the custom lighting package ran, because I was the one who had personally approved the vendor contracts for this building months ago. But to the rest of the room, to my family and their guests, I was just Jamal's underachieving sister who somehow managed to find a decent dress, The room was already buzzing with loud conversation and the clinking of expensive champagne glasses. I kept my posture completely straight, gliding across the marble floor as I took in the scene. I watched Jamal's fraternity brothers loudly laughing and slapping each other on the back at the VIP tables located right next to the polished oak dance floor. Tiffany's sorority sisters were seated on the opposite side in prime viewing positions, already posing for pictures with their perfectly practiced smiles and adjusting their expensive designer gowns. Even our distant relatives, people we had not spoken to in over a decade, had been given premium placement. I saw my great-aunt Denise, Aunt Beatrice, and a whole row of church mothers seated at a beautifully arranged family table near the head table. They were wearing their finest, most elaborate Sunday hats in pastel shades of lavender and cream, sipping sparkling water and openly judging everyone who walked past them. I could feel their eyes tracking my movements. Aunt Beatrice leaned over and whispered something behind her hand to Denise, and they both shook their heads with exaggerated pity. To them, I was the cautionary tale. I was the girl who threw away a university education to scrub pots and pans while Jamal was their golden beacon of success. Their whispers followed in my wake like a toxic shadow, but I kept my chin parallel to the floor and kept walking. I ignored their stares and approached the massive gold-framed seating chart displayed on an ornate wooden easel near the main entrance. The chart was a work of art itself, featuring elegant hand-lettered calligraphy on thick textured parchment. I scanned the beautifully written names looking for my own. I checked table 1, table 2, all the way down through the premium sections. Then I checked the middle tier tables. Finally, I scanned the tables located near the back of the room. My name was nowhere to be found. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought perhaps it was a genuine administrative mistake. But growing up in my family had taught me a harsh reality. Their cruelty was never accidental. It was always meticulously calculated. A young venue staffer wearing a crisp dark uniform noticed me lingering by the easel and politely stepped forward. He was holding a leather-bound clipboard and had a look of eager professionalism on his face. "Excuse me, miss. Are you having trouble finding your seat?" he asked, his tone polite and accommodating. I gave him my first and last name, offering a polite smile. He flipped through the first page of the master guest list, then the second, his brow furrowing slightly as his finger traced down the columns of names. "Ah, yes," he finally said, his voice suddenly dropping to a highly uncomfortable whisper. He looked up at me, clearly embarrassed by what he had to say next. "You are not on the main floor plan, ma'am. Your seat is located in the overflow section." He gestured awkwardly toward the far back corner of the massive room, a space that was completely disconnected from the rest of the lavish celebration. I thanked the young man, sparing him from any further awkwardness, and began walking in the direction he had pointed. As I moved further away from the glittering center of the room, the plush carpet seemed to grow thinner. The tables became sparser, and the warm, golden lighting gave way to harsher, darker shadows. I finally reached the very back wall directly adjacent to the heavy, swinging wooden doors of the men's restroom. And there it was. Sitting entirely by itself against the boldly patterned wallpaper was a rusted metal folding chair. It was scratch-dented and completely stripped of any dignity. It did not even match the elegant white padded chairs used for the rest of the reception. It looked like something dragged out of an abandoned storage closet in a rundown high school. Slapped carelessly across the cold metal backrest was a piece of bright blue painter's tape. My name was scribbled across the tape in thick, messy black permanent marker. I stood frozen, staring at the blue tape. Every time the restroom door swung open to let a male guest in or out, a harsh gust of air washed over the metal chair. The air carried the distinct, unmistakable chemical smell of industrial bleach mixed with the sharp odor of urinal cakes. This was not an administrative oversight. This was a direct statement. They had intentionally placed me in the most degrading, humiliating spot in the entire $250,000 venue. They wanted me to literally sit in the stench of the bathrooms while they dined on filet mignon under crystal chandeliers. Just as I reached out to trace the rough edge of the blue tape with my fingertip, A heavy hand clapped down hard on my shoulder. I turned slowly to see my brother Jamal flanked by three of his closest groomsmen. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of expensive scotch, and exuding an air of supreme, untouchable arrogance. "Hey, you found your spot," Jamal said, a condescending smirk playing loudly on his lips. His groomsmen chuckled nervously, their eyes darting between the rusted folding chair, the restroom doors, and my face. They knew it was fundamentally wrong, but none of them had the spine to say a single word against the groom. I looked Jamal dead in the eye, refusing to let him see even an ounce of hurt or betrayal. "You put your own sister by the urinals, Jamal," I asked, keeping my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. He shrugged his shoulders, completely unapologetic and utterly devoid of empathy. "Look, sis, you need to understand how things work," Jamal said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he always used when he wanted to assert his dominance over me. "The guest list today is strictly elite. Tiffany and I have a very specific image to maintain. My senior colleagues from the financial firm are here. Major corporate investors are sitting at those front tables. These are people who matter to my career. You are just a caterer. You dropped out of school. You do not exactly fit the demographic of our social circle anymore." He stepped a few inches closer, his expensive cologne completely masking the smell of the bleach for a brief second. Besides, he continued gesturing vaguely toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, located just down the hall from the bathrooms. "Sitting back here is actually very practical for you. Since you are so used to working in the service industry, you can help the venue staff clear the dirty plates later when the dinner rush starts. It will give you something to do so you do not feel completely out of place among successful people." I stared at him, letting his venomous words hang in the air between us. The audacity was almost breathtaking. He had drained every ounce of our mother's affection, demanded every financial resource our family had to secure his own future, and now he was demanding my free labor at his own wedding while forcing me to sit by a toilet. "Do not embarrass me tonight, Charmaine," Jamal warned, his fake smile vanishing, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Just keep your head down, stay out of the professional photographs, and try not to bother the important guests. If you play nice, maybe I will let you take home some leftover cake at the end of the night." Jamal laughed at his own joke, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed over the ambient music of the room. He was trying to provoke me. He wanted me to throw a tantrum, to scream and cry, so he could point his finger and show all his wealthy friends how unstable and jealous his little sister was. It was a classic manipulative trap he had been setting for me since we were young children. Whenever I reacted to his bullying, my mother would always punish me for being emotional, completely ignoring his constant instigation. But I was no longer a child, and I had learned how to play the game much better than he ever could. Jamal patted my shoulder one last time, a patronizing gesture that made my skin crawl. He turned around and walked back toward the brilliantly lit center of the room, his groomsmen trailing behind him like obedient puppies. I watched him go, taking his place at the center of the dance floor, laughing loudly and raising his glass of scotch to the cheering crowd. He felt completely invincible. He felt like the absolute king of the world. I looked down at the rusted metal chair one last time. I did not sit down. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned around, gripping my small silk clutch, and began walking purposefully toward the grand exit doors. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. The time for playing the compliant, forgotten sister was officially over. Jamal thought he was a financial genius running the show, but he was merely a tenant in a building I owned, and his lease was about to be abruptly terminated. I paused halfway to the grand exit doors. The heavy brass handles were just inches from my fingertips, promising an easy escape from the humiliation. But walking away right then felt like a surrender. If I left before the reception even officially began, Jamal and my mother Elaine would simply spin a new narrative. They would tell all their wealthy friends that I was too jealous to stay, too unstable to support my own brother's success. I needed to witness the full extent of their delusion. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to take this charade before I brought the entire production crashing down around them. I turned back around, navigating through the sea of perfectly decorated tables, and took my designated seat on that cold, rusted metal folding chair by the men's restroom. The moment I sat down, the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung completely open, and the reception officially commenced. The hired DJ's voice boomed over the state-of-the-art sound system, hyping up the crowd as the bridal party made their grand entrances. The groomsmen danced their way into the room, followed by the bridesmaids twirling in their expensive gowns. Finally, Jamal and Tiffany made their entrance to thunderous applause. They bathed in the spotlight, waving at the crowd like visiting royalty. The crystal chandeliers flickered in time with the music, creating a blinding spectacle of manufactured perfection. From my vantage point by the bathroom, I had a perfect view of the entire room, and more importantly, the entire room had a perfect view of me. The social isolation was immediate and entirely intentional. As the music settled down and the first course of dinner was served, the designated family tables became a hub of vicious gossip. Great Aunt Denise and Aunt Beatrice did not even try to hide their disdain. They sat just a few tables away from my exiled corner, their heavily powdered faces leaning in close to one another as they loudly discussed my life choices. "Look at her sitting back there!" Aunt Beatrice whispered loudly, her voice carrying easily over the clinking of silverware. "Elaine must be so heartbroken. Raising a son who is a senior director, only to have a daughter who refuses to make anything of herself. It is a crying shame, really." Denise nodded vigorously, her elaborate lavender hat bobbing up and down. "I heard she is still just working in kitchens," Denise replied, casting a side eye in my direction. "You would think she would have the decency to at least pretend to be successful for one night. But no, she sits by the toilet looking miserable. Bless her heart, she just does not have Jamal's ambition." I endured their stares and their thinly veiled insults, keeping my face completely impassive. They were so deeply entrenched in the family mythology that Jamal was the savior and I was the burden. They had no idea that the very plates they were eating off of, the linen napkins they were dabbing their mouths with, and the chair cushions they were sitting on were all paid for by my company. The irony was almost suffocating. As the first course was cleared, the venue staff began moving swiftly through the room. A server named Julian, one of my most reliable employees at Lumina Estates, approached my corner to clear the empty glasses near the restroom hallway. When he made eye contact with me sitting on the rusted metal chair, his eyes widened in absolute shock. He immediately lowered his tray, his professional composure faltering. "Ms. Charmaine," Julian whispered frantically, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "What are you doing sitting back here? Let me get the floor manager right now. We can set up a proper table for you in the VIP section immediately. This is entirely unacceptable." I gave Julian a very subtle microscopic shake of my head. I offered him a warm, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Julian, but I am exactly where I need to be right now," I replied quietly. "Please, just treat me like any other guest. Do not alert the manager just yet. The night is still young, and I do not want to spoil the groom's special moment." Julian looked deeply conflicted, but he knew better than to question my direct orders. He nodded respectfully, picked up his tray, and hurried back toward the kitchen. He knew I was the owner of the venue, but he also knew I demanded absolute discretion. He left me alone again in my shadowed corner, the smell of industrial bleach wafting over me every time the bathroom door swung open. The dinner service continued, an extravagant display of wealth that Jamal could not actually afford. I watched him at the head table laughing uproariously with his fraternity brothers, completely ignoring my existence. He was thoroughly enjoying the power trip, reveling in the fact that he had successfully put me in my place. But his arrogance was blinding him to the reality of his own situation. Just as the main course of filet mignon and truffle asparagus was being served to the VIP tables, I saw Tiffany stand up from the head table. She smoothed down the front of her custom beaded gown, whispered something into Jamal's ear that made him smirk, and began walking purposefully across the ballroom. She bypassed the wealthy investors, ignored the church aunties, and marched straight toward the back corner where I was sitting. As she approached, the heavy scent of her expensive floral perfume clashed aggressively with the smell of the urinal cakes from the restroom. She stopped right in front of my rusted chair, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in one hand, her diamond ring sparkling obnoxiously under the dim lighting of the hallway. Charmaine Tiffany said, her voice dripping with fake concern that was entirely for the benefit of anyone watching. "We need to talk." I remained seated, looking up at her with a calm, neutral expression. "What is it, Tiffany?" I asked mildly. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shifting her weight from one designer heel to the other. "Look, you are really bringing down the mood of the entire room. My bridesmaids keep asking why Jamal's sister is sitting by the bathroom looking like a stray dog. You are depressing my guests, and it is ruining the aesthetic of my reception video." She reached into the small beaded clutch tucked under her arm and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. She shoved it aggressively toward my chest, forcing me to take it or let it fall to the floor. I took the crumpled bill, holding it lightly between my fingers. I looked at the wrinkled face of Andrew Jackson, then looked back up at Tiffany's smug, heavily contoured face. "If you could not afford a wedding gift, just leave?" Tiffany sneered, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "We all know you are struggling, but you do not need to sit here and throw a pity party. Take this $20 and call an Uber pool. Go back to your little apartment. Jamal and I will tell everyone you had a catering emergency and had to leave for work. Just go." The entire ballroom seemed to fade away into white noise. This was the ultimate disrespect. It was not just the rusted chair or the placement by the bathroom or the constant gaslighting from my mother. It was the absolute conviction that my worth could be measured by a crumpled $20 bill handed out of pity. Tiffany honestly believed she was doing me a favor by paying me to disappear. The church aunties were watching intently from their premium tables, waiting for me to break down. Elaine was watching from the head table, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Jamal was laughing with his groomsmen, completely oblivious to his new wife's cruel stunt, or perhaps entirely supportive of it. The audience expected me to cry. They expected me to lower my head in shame, clutch that $20 bill like a lifeline, and slink out the back door in total defeat. Instead, I looked at the $20 bill in my hand. Then I looked across the lavish $250,000 ballroom at my brother, who was living a lie funded by stolen money. I did not cry. I did not yell. I laughed softly. It was a genuine melodic laugh that bubbled up from the sheer absurdity of the situation. Tiffany recoiled slightly, clearly taken aback by my reaction. Her smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. I stood up slowly from the rusted metal chair, smoothing down the front of my emerald green silk dress. I stepped uncomfortably close to Tiffany, towering over her despite her designer heels. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression shifting from amusement to absolute ice. I took the crumpled $20 bill and casually dropped it directly into her crystal flute of vintage champagne. The green paper floated on the bubbles for a brief second before slowly sinking to the bottom of the glass, ruining the expensive drink entirely. "Keep the change, Tiffany," I said, my voice perfectly level and deadly quiet. "You are going to need every single cent of it very, very soon." Before she could even process the insult, I turned my back on her. I did not look at the church aunties. I did not look at my mother. I walked straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine marble floor. I pushed open the heavy brass double doors and walked out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving the stifling toxicity of my family behind me for good. The time for playing the victim was over. It was time to make a phone call. The valet attendant stationed by the grand entrance immediately stood at attention as I approached. They recognized me not as the banished sister of the groom, but as the woman who signed their paychecks. One of them, a young man named Leo, hurried forward, his white gloves stark against the night. "Good evening, Ms. Charmaine," he said respectfully, reaching for his radio. "Shall I bring your vehicle around?" "No need, Leo," I replied, offering a polite nod. "I will walk to it." I bypassed the crowded rideshare pickup area where Tiffany had expected me to wait for an Uber pool. Instead, I walked straight toward the heavily guarded private VIP parking section reserved exclusively for the venue's owner and top-tier executives. I reached into my small silk clutch and pulled out my key fob. I pressed the unlock button. A few yards away, the sleek, imposing silhouette of a custom midnight black Mercedes Maybach chirped twice. The laser headlights illuminated the pavement, and the hidden door handles extended outward in a silent greeting. The car was worth well over $200,000, a quiet testament to the empire I had built from the ground up. I slid into the driver's seat, the buttery, soft cream-colored leather wrapping around me like a protective shield. The cabin was perfectly silent, completely insulated from the thumping bass of Jamal's wedding reception, taking place just a few hundred feet away inside my building. I let out a long, slow breath. The smell of Tiffany's cheap $20 bill still lingered on my fingers, completely eclipsed by the scent of new leather and expensive luxury. I opened the center console, pulled out my encrypted laptop, and rested it on my lap. The screen flickered to life, the bright logo of Lumina Estates illuminating the dark cabin. I was not a caterer. I was not a failure who dropped out of college because the coursework was too hard. I left university because I had identified a massive gap in the luxury event and real estate market, and I refused to waste 4 years reading textbooks when I could be building a business. Over the past decade, I had quietly acquired, renovated, and managed the most exclusive properties in Atlanta, establishing Lumina Estates as the absolute pinnacle of high-end venues. I kept my name off the public-facing documents, operating through a series of anonymous LLCs to maintain my privacy and protect my peace. My family never asked about my life, and I never volunteered the information. They were so committed to the narrative of my failure that they never bothered to look past their own arrogance. Before I could even open my email client to contact my legal team, the Maybach's infotainment screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed the name of David, my chief financial officer. David was a brilliant, meticulous man who never worked late on a Saturday night unless something was catastrophically wrong. I tapped the screen to answer. The audio routing perfectly through the premium surround sound system. David, I said, keeping my voice calm. It is a Saturday night. What is the emergency? Ms. Charmaine. David began, his voice tight with professional anxiety. I sincerely apologize for interrupting your evening, but we have a massive problem with the primary venue rental for tonight. The payment system just flagged a critical failure on the account holding the reservation at the main estate. I narrowed my eyes, looking through the tinted windshield at the glowing facade of the ballroom. Go on, I instructed. It is regarding the groom. Jamal David explained, the rapid clicking of his keyboard audible in the background. The final payment for the venue, the catering, and the luxury service package was processed using a cashier's check for $150,000. The bank just contacted our accounting department. The check bounced hard. It is completely fraudulent. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat. The absolute sheer audacity of the situation washed over me in a wave of cold clarity. Jamal, the golden child. Jamal, the senior financial director who loved to look down his nose at everyone. Jamal, who had just forced me to sit on a rusted metal chair by the men's restroom because I supposedly did not fit in with his elite demographic. He was currently inside my multi-million-dollar property, drinking my top-shelf champagne, eating my imported filet mignon, and flexing his fake wealth to his fraternity brothers, all while attempting to pay my company with a fraudulent piece of paper. Are you absolutely certain it is fraudulent, David? I asked, needing to hear the explicit confirmation. Could it be a banking error or a simple lack of available funds? I am absolutely certain, David replied without a second of hesitation. Our bank fraud liaison confirmed it directly. The account the check was drawn from does not have anywhere near the necessary capital, and the routing numbers appear to have been intentionally manipulated to delay the verification process until after the weekend. This was not an accident, Ms. Charmaine. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to defraud Lumina Estates. They planned to host the entire wedding, consume the services, and deal with the fallout on Monday morning. A dark, humorless chuckle escaped my lips. Jamal had always been arrogant, but I never realized he was this spectacularly foolish. He genuinely believed he could outsmart a corporate financial system just to maintain his facade of immense wealth for a few hours. He wanted the $250,000 wedding aesthetic to impress Tiffany's social climbing friends. but he did not have a single dime to his name. "David," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping fully into the commanding tone of a chief executive officer. "Send the complete financial file to my secure email right now. Every single document Jamal submitted to secure this venue, the initial deposit receipts, the contracts, the identification copies, and the bounced check notification. I want it all in front of me immediately." "Yes, ma'am," David replied instantly. "The file is being encrypted and sent to your inbox as we speak. How would you like us to proceed regarding the ongoing event?" Standard protocol dictates an immediate shutdown for fraudulent payment, but given the size of the gathering, we usually require executive authorization to dispatch security. "Do not dispatch anyone just yet," I commanded. "I need to review these documents first. I will call you back in exactly 5 minutes with my final decision. Have the legal team and the head of security on standby." "Understood," David said, and the line went dead. I stared at the dashboard, my mind racing through the implications. My mother, Elaine, had practically demanded I grovel before Jamal because he was supposedly a titan of industry. Tiffany had shoved a $20 bill into my hand out of sheer pity. They had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people, treating me like dirt beneath their expensive shoes. And the entire time, their perfect, untouchable king was committing federal wire fraud. The email notification pinged on my laptop. I opened the encrypted file David had sent. The screen populated with high-resolution scans of Jamal's rental agreements and financial submissions. I scrolled past the standard venue waivers and the catering selections, my eyes scanning the fine print of the financial guarantees. I needed to see exactly how he had managed to secure the initial booking before the final check bounced. I clicked on the document containing the source account information for the initial $50,000 deposit. As the page loaded, I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracing the account holder's name. It was not Jamal's name. It was a joint account, but the primary holder was listed clearly in bold black letters. Elaine, my mother. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the transaction history attached to the file. Jamal had not just used her account. He had completely liquidated it. The account that held Elaine's retirement savings, the money my late father had meticulously set aside for her care, had been drained down to the last cent to pay the non-refundable deposit for this lavish fake wedding. Jamal had robbed our mother blind to pay for his centerpieces and his velvet tuxedo. But the horror did not stop there. The initial deposit only covered a fraction of the total cost. I opened the final document, the line of credit application Jamal had submitted to cover the remaining balance, before attempting to pass the fake cashier's check. As I read the guarantor section, a wave of pure, unfiltered rage ignited in my chest. There, printed clearly at the bottom of the credit application, was my name, Charmaine. And right next to it, scrawled in blue ink, was a signature that vaguely resembled mine, but was undeniably forged. Jamal had been unemployed. He had drained our mother's retirement fund, and when he ran out of her money, he had forged my signature to secure a massive line of credit, attempting to tether me to his catastrophic debt. He had committed identity theft, fraud, and elder abuse, all so he could look like a king for one night. And then he had the nerve, the absolute unmitigated gall, to tell me I was an embarrassment to the family and force me to sit by the toilets. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. The soft leather of the Maybach suddenly felt like a war room. The sadness I had felt earlier in the evening evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating determination. They had stripped me of my dignity, dismissed my worth, and tried to ruin my financial future. Now they were going to learn exactly who owned the ground they were dancing on. I picked up my smartphone from the center console and dialed David's direct number. He answered on the very first ring, anticipating my command. The silence in the Maybach was absolute, a perfect vacuum that allowed me to focus entirely on the destruction I was about to orchestrate. "I have reviewed the entire file, David," I said, my voice completely stripped of any familial emotion. I was no longer the discarded sister who had been banished to a rusted metal chair by a toilet. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Lumina Estates, a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and my company was actively under attack. The documents are indeed fraudulent. But the situation is much worse than a simple bounced check. The perpetrator has committed identity theft. He forged my signature on the line of credit to secure the remaining balance. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Your signature, ma'am," David asked, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second as his brain tried to process the sheer stupidity of the crime. The groom forged the owner's signature to defraud the owner's company. "Exactly," I replied coldly. "He is completely unaware of my position here, which makes his crime incredibly foolish, but no less severe in the eyes of the law. He also drained a vulnerable elderly woman's retirement account to pay the initial deposit. Here are your directives, David. Listen carefully, because we are only going to execute this operation once." I sat up perfectly straight in the soft leather seat, my posture reflecting the absolute authority I held over the situation. "First, freeze the entire account profile for this event immediately. Void the venue contract in our main operating system, citing federal financial fraud. Do not process any further catering or bar tabs. Lock the registers. Second, I want you to personally contact the Atlanta Police Department. Do not call the standard emergency dispatch line. I want you to call our direct liaison in the white-collar financial crimes division." I took a slow breath, feeling the final traces of my childhood subjugation evaporate into the air conditioning of the car. "Tell the detectives that we have a suspect actively on our premises who has committed interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny totaling $250,000. Tell them the suspect is a flight risk and we need officers dispatched to the property immediately. Have them bypass the main entrance and wait for my signal quietly at the rear loading dock. We do not want to tip him off before the trap is fully sprung." "Understood perfectly, Ms. Charmaine," David said, his voice returning to its usual crisp corporate efficiency. "I am making the call to the detectives right now. The financial accounts are locked. No one is leaving with a single piece of Lumina Estates property tonight." "Good," I said. "Now patch me through to Marcus." I waited for the secure line to transfer. Marcus was the head of venue security for all of my Atlanta properties. He was a former military police officer who ran his security details with the precision of a tactical military unit. He was fiercely loyal to me and had zero tolerance for anyone disrespecting the staff or the venues. He answered the radio transfer with a gruff alert greeting. "Boss," Marcus said over the secured frequency. "David just sent the red flag alert to my terminal. What is the play?" "Marcus, we have a massive security breach in the grand ballroom," I explained, keeping my directives rapid and ruthless. "The groom is a fraud. The event is completely, entirely unfunded and illegal. I am shutting the entire wedding down right now. I need you to implement a total perimeter lockdown." "Copy that," Marcus replied, the sound of heavy boots moving quickly across tile echoing in the background of his microphone. "Moving my tactical team into position now. Do you want us to quietly escort the groom out the back door to avoid a scene with the guests?" "Absolutely not," I stated, my tone dropping to a dangerous icy register. "He wanted a massive public spectacle tonight, and I am going to give him one. This is how we are going to do it. I want your men positioned at all 4 main exit doors of the ballroom. Do not let anyone enter or leave once the sequence begins. Instruct the catering staff to step back from the tables and the bartenders to drop their shakers. I want the staff safely out of the crossfire." "Understood. Staff is being pulled to the perimeter. What is the signal?" I looked at the glowing face of my digital watch. "Give me exactly 3 minutes to get back inside the building. Once I am in position at the main entrance, I want you to kill the fairy tale. Cut the music. I do not want a slow fade out. I want a hard, jarring stop. Let the silence shock the room. Immediately after the music dies, flip the main breaker for the ballroom's custom ambient lighting." I pictured the elaborate setup inside, the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of aesthetic manipulation designed to make Jamal and Tiffany look like royalty. "Turn off the crystal chandeliers," I commanded. "Turn off the romantic wall-up lighting. Turn off the spotlights on the head table. I want all of it gone. Instead, I want you to flip the switch for the industrial, emergency fluorescent lighting. Turn them all up to maximum brightness." There was a low chuckle from Marcus on the other end of the line. He understood exactly what I was doing. The emergency lights were incredibly harsh, unforgiving, and designed strictly for safety inspections and cleaning crews. They cast a sickly blue-white glow over everything. I want the room to look exactly like the crime scene it currently is. I continued, my eyes narrowing at the memory of Tiffany shoving that crumpled $20 bill into my hand. I want those bright clinical lights to illuminate every single flaw in Tiffany's heavily contoured makeup. I want every cheap, glued-on seam of her dress exposed to the high society guests she invited. I want them to see the ugly reality hiding underneath all the expensive shadows. It will be done, boss. We will light them up like a police interrogation room. My team will be waiting for you at the front doors. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I reached for the door handle of the Maybach and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool Georgia night. The gravel crunched softly beneath the soles of my designer heels. I took a moment to smooth down the front of my emerald green silk dress, adjusting the fabric so it sat perfectly across my shoulders. I did not look like a caterer. I looked like a woman who commanded an empire. I closed the heavy car door and began the walk back toward the grand entrance of Lumina Estates. The air was thick with the scent of blooming night jasmine and the distant thumping bass of the wedding reception. With every step I took, I felt a heavy, lifelong weight lifting from my shoulders. For 35 years, I had allowed my mother and my brother to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to gaslight me into believing I was the defective piece of our family puzzle. I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. I had sat in the corner, literally by the toilets, hoping that my compliance would eventually earn their respect. But compliance never earns respect from toxic people. It only invites further abuse. Tonight I was breaking the cycle permanently. As I approached the towering glass doors of the main lobby, 3 massive men stepped out from the shadows of the grand columns. It was Marcus and 2 of his top security lieutenants. They were dressed in immaculate tailored black suits with discreet earpieces spiraled into their collars. They stood at rigid attention as I walked up the marble steps. They did not see the disappointing daughter of Elaine. They saw the woman who signed their paychecks and protected their livelihoods. "Area is secure," Ms. Charmaine, Marcus said, stepping to my right side to flank me. "The police detectives have just arrived at the loading dock. They are reviewing the forged documents David sent over and are standing by for our signal to enter the floor. The catering staff has been completely pulled back into the kitchens. The trap is set." I nodded slowly, looking through the tinted glass doors at the brilliant golden glow spilling out from the grand ballroom at the end of the hall. The vibrations of the bass shook the glass slightly under my fingertips. Inside that room, Jamal was holding court. He was raising a glass of stolen champagne, laughing with his friends, completely convinced of his own invincibility. He thought he was the apex predator of our family, the golden child who could do no wrong, who could take whatever he wanted without consequence. He had no idea that the predator had just walked into the cage and the doors had been locked from the outside. "Are you ready?" Boss Marcus asked softly, his eyes scanning the empty lobby. I took one final deep breath, letting the icy resolve settle deep into my bones. The hurt little sister was dead and gone. The chief executive officer had arrived to collect on the debt. "Open the doors, Marcus," I said, my voice ringing clear and hard in the quiet night. "Let us go ruin a wedding." Marcus pushed the heavy brass handles and we stepped into the lobby. The hunter had officially become the hunted. We moved quietly down the long carpeted corridor leading to the grand ballroom. The thick walls of the estate absorbed most of the sound, but as we drew closer, the muffled thumping of the bass grew into a physical vibration beneath my feet. We stopped just outside the main double doors, obscured by the shadows of the hallway. Through the tall glass panels, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the spectacle unfolding inside. Jamal and Tiffany had taken the center of the polished oak dance floor for their choreographed first dance. The room was a masterclass in manufactured perfection. A fog machine rolled a thick layer of white mist across the floor, making it look as though they were dancing on clouds. A soft romantic rhythm and blues track echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. Jamal was holding Tiffany close, spinning her around with exaggerated dips and twirls clearly designed for a viral social media moment. The crowd was completely captivated by the lie. Tiffany's sorority sisters were crowded around the edge of the dance floor, holding up their smartphones, capturing every single angle of the supposedly wealthy couple. Jamal's fraternity brothers were cheering loudly from the VIP section, raising their expensive crystal glasses in a toast to their successful friend. At the premium family tables, I could see my mother Elaine dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a linen napkin, overcome with emotion at the sight of her perfect golden child achieving the ultimate milestone. It was a beautiful, flawless illusion, and every single second of it was funded by stolen money, elder abuse, and my forged signature. I stood in the darkness watching them bask in the adoration of their peers, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. I turned to Marcus and gave him a single definitive nod. Marcus raised his left wrist to his mouth, speaking into the discreet microphone hidden in his cuff. Execute Phase 1, he ordered, his voice flat and authoritative. Cut the audio. Inside the ballroom, the fairy tale shattered with violent suddenness. The sound engineer, following Marcus's direct command, did not simply fade the music out to a gentle stop. He pulled the master power switch on the entire audio board. The romantic ballad was instantly interrupted by a deafening high-pitched screech of electronic feedback, followed immediately by a loud, echoing pop that sounded like a gunshot. The sudden heavy silence that crashed over the room was absolute and suffocating. Jamal and Tiffany froze mid-twirl, looking up at the ceiling in shock. The cheers from the fraternity brothers died in their throats. The sorority sisters lowered their phones, looking around the room in mass confusion. A wave of anxious murmurs rippled through the 300 guests. Jamal, ever the arrogant showman, forced a loud, booming laugh, attempting to play off the disruption as a minor technical difficulty. He waved his hand dismissively at the crowd, smiling broadly, as if he were still entirely in control of the situation. Execute Phase 2. Marcus whispered into his radio. Drop the lighting. The multi-million-dollar custom lighting array responded instantly. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended above the dance floor went completely black. The warm, amber uplighting that bathed the silk-draped walls vanished. The spotlights focused on the head table, and the towering white orchids were killed. For one terrifying, disorienting second, the massive ballroom was plunged into pitch darkness. The crowd let out a collective, panicked gasp. I could hear chairs scraping against the marble floor as guests nervously shifted in their seats. Elaine let out a startled yelp. Then the trap was fully sprung. Hit the emergency grid, Marcus commanded. With a loud, mechanical buzzing sound, the industrial emergency fluorescent lights slammed on all at once. These lights were never meant to be seen by guests. They were designed strictly for late-night cleaning crews and safety inspections. They were blindingly bright, casting a harsh, clinical blue-white glare over every single inch of the massive room. The transformation was brutal and immediate. The warm, forgiving glow of luxury was instantly replaced by the sterile, unforgiving illumination of a police interrogation room. The lighting was designed to expose every flaw, and it executed its purpose flawlessly. Under the harsh fluorescent glare, the towering white orchid centerpieces suddenly looked garish and overwhelming. But the most devastating damage was inflicted directly on the bride and groom standing frozen in the center of the dance floor. Tiffany's meticulously curated aesthetic completely disintegrated. The heavy contouring and highlighting on her face, which had looked flawless under the amber mood lighting, now looked like streaky, exaggerated theatrical paint. But her dress suffered the most. She had demanded a dim romantic lighting package specifically to hide the fact that her custom beaded gown was a cheap, hastily assembled replica. Under the blinding emergency lights, every glued seam, every fraying thread, and the uneven jagged hemline were exposed for the entire high society crowd to see. She looked like a child wearing a discount Halloween costume. Jamal did not fare any better. His custom velvet tuxedo, stripped of the warm lighting, looked dusty, stiff, and incredibly cheap. The illusion of immense generational wealth and elite status evaporated in the blink of an eye, leaving behind two desperate people standing on a wooden floor in bad lighting. Tiffany realized what was happening to her image almost immediately. She saw her sorority sisters staring at her, their expressions shifting rapidly from awe to secondhand embarrassment. Some of them were whispering behind their hands. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Tiffany's face. She broke away from Jamal and lunged toward the edge of the stage. grabbing the microphone that had been left on a stand from the best man's speech. DJ, fix the music right now, Tiffany shrieked into the microphone. Her voice echoed shrilly through the cavernous quiet room, entirely devoid of her usual practiced elegance. Turn those disgusting lights off immediately. Do you know how much we paid for this venue? Fix it. But there was no response from the elevated audio booth. Through the harsh, buzzing light, the crowd watched as two large security guards dressed in black suits stepped into the booth. They firmly placed their hands on the hired DJ's shoulders, instructing him to pack up his equipment. The DJ looked terrified. He hastily closed his laptop, grabbed his headphones, and was quickly escorted out a side exit, disappearing into the service hallways. The realization that this was not a simple blown fuse or a technical glitch began to spread through the ballroom like wildfire. This was an intentional shutdown. At the premium family tables, Aunt Beatrice stood up slowly, clutching her beaded purse tightly against her chest. Great Aunt Denise looked around with wide, fearful eyes. The church aunties who had spent the entire evening judging my rusted folding chair by the restroom were now looking at the exits with growing alarm. The wealthy investors and corporate colleagues Jamal had invited to witness his fake success stopped whispering and began quietly collecting their coats from the backs of their chairs. Elaine pushed her chair back violently and stood up at the head table. She looked around wildly, her face red with indignation. "Where is the manager?" Elaine demanded loudly, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Someone get the manager out here immediately. My son is a senior financial director, and you are ruining his wedding." Marcus did not wait for the murmurs to turn into a full-blown panic. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the ballroom, his massive, imposing frame casting a long shadow under the fluorescent lights. His two security lieutenants followed close behind, immediately fanning out to block the side exits. Marcus marched straight down the center aisle, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the marble floor. He did not rush. He moved with the calculated, predatory confidence of a man who held absolute power over the room. Jamal saw Marcus approaching and immediately puffed out his chest, stepping in front of Tiffany to play the role of the protective, wealthy groom. He was desperately trying to maintain his alpha male facade in front of his fraternity brothers. "Hey," Jamal yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus's chest. "Who the hell are you? Get the lights back on and get the music playing right now. Do you know who I am? I demand to see the owner of this building immediately." Marcus completely ignored Jamal's posturing. He did not even break his stride. He walked right past my brother as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient piece of furniture. Marcus stepped up onto the raised stage, reached out, and calmly took the microphone directly from Tiffany's trembling hand. He tapped the top of the microphone once. The sharp, percussive thud echoed through the speakers, instantly silencing the remaining whispers in the room. Every single eye in the ballroom was locked on the head of security. Marcus looked out over the crowd of 300 elite guests, his expression carved from stone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his deep, booming baritone echoing off the crystal chandeliers and vaulted ceilings. "May I have your complete attention?" The room was so quiet, you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning units. "This event is entirely shut down, effective immediately." Marcus stated his words clipped and brutally precise. "The venue contract has been voided due to federal wire fraud and non-payment of services." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the room. The words, "federal wire fraud," hung in the air like a physical weight. The corporate investors Jamal had tried to impress exchanged alarmed, frantic glances. Tiffany's jaw dropped open, her eyes darting wildly to Jamal, who had suddenly turned the color of chalk. Marcus did not flinch. He did not offer any apologies for the inconvenience. He simply delivered the final devastating directive. "Evacuate the premises immediately," Marcus commanded, pointing toward the main exit doors where I stood waiting in the shadows. "Leave your drinks on the tables. Proceed to the nearest exits in an orderly fashion. The Atlanta Police Department is currently waiting outside." The sheer weight of the words "Atlanta Police Department" hit the room like a physical blow. For a split second, nobody moved. Then absolute chaos erupted. The pristine, choreographed elegance of the reception dissolved into a frantic, panicked scramble. Chairs screeched against the marble floor as 300 guests simultaneously realized they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene. The corporate investors and financial colleagues Jamal had so desperately wanted to impress were the very first to move. These were men and women who understood exactly what federal wire fraud entailed. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with an active police investigation. They dropped their linen napkins, abandoned their expensive cocktails, and made a beeline for the side exits, not even stopping to offer Jamal a single word of sympathy or support. At the premium family tables, the dignified church mothers lost every ounce of their manufactured composure. Great Aunt Denise grabbed her beaded purse so quickly she knocked over a crystal water pitcher, shattering it across the table. Aunt Beatrice was gripping her lavender hat to her head, whispering frantic prayers under her breath as she practically dragged her husband toward the doors. They had spent the entire evening judging me for sitting by the bathroom, but now they were fleeing the room like rats abandoning a sinking ship, terrified that their own reputations would be tarnished by association. In the center of the dance floor, Jamal was rapidly hyperventilating. The reality of the situation was crashing down around him, but his narcissism refused to let him accept defeat. He could not process the fact that his grand illusion had been shattered in front of his entire social circle. Instead of submitting to the reality of his crimes, his survival instinct kicked, and he chose to double down on his fake persona. Jamal stormed across the dance floor, his face flushed a furious dark crimson. He marched directly up to Marcus, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to physically intimidate a man who was twice his size and possessed actual legitimate authority. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. He jabbed his index finger into the solid wall of Marcus's chest. "I am a senior financial director. I am a highly respected corporate executive in this city. I paid $250,000 to rent this venue, and you have no right to shut down my wedding over some administrative glitch." Marcus did not flinch. He looked down at Jamal's finger, then back up to his face, his expression completely blank. "Step back from me, sir." Marcus warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I will not step back," Jamal bellowed, playing to the shrinking audience of his fraternity brothers who were hovering uncertainly near the VIP tables. "You are making a massive mistake. Your accounting department is incompetent. Get your manager out here right now. Get whoever is in charge. I am going to sue this entire company into the ground. I will personally see to it that Lumina Estates goes bankrupt for this humiliation." While Jamal was throwing his empty threats at the head of security, Tiffany was having a spectacular, highly public meltdown of her own. She had completely ignored the mention of police and federal fraud. Her mind could only process the immediate tragedy of her ruined social media aesthetic. She was practically vibrating with hysterical anger, pacing back and forth under the blinding fluorescent lights that showcased every cheap flaw in her wedding gown. "My photos are ruined!" Tiffany shrieked, kicking at the layer of artificial fog that was rapidly dissipating on the floor. She pointed a trembling hand at the empty DJ booth. "Turn the mood lighting back on. My photographer cannot work in this hideous lighting. This is my special day. You are destroying my Instagram content. I have brand sponsorships riding on this wedding. You are ruining my life over a stupid billing error." She grabbed the heavy skirt of her dress and stomped over to one of the security lieutenants, demanding he flip the breakers back. She was so entirely consumed by her own vanity that she could not see the actual legal disaster unfolding around her new husband. Just as the security guard stepped forward to block Tiffany from reaching the light switches, my mother threw herself into the fray. Elaine pushed her way past the fleeing guests, her custom fascinator sitting slightly askew on her head. Her face was contorted with the fierce, blind indignation she only ever reserved for defending Jamal. "How dare you treat my family this way?" Elaine yelled, stepping right up next to Jamal to form their usual united front. She glared at Marcus as if he were a disobedient child. "My son is a financial genius. He is a good, successful man. If there is a problem with the payment, it is because your banking system is flawed, not because my son did anything wrong." Elaine swept her arm out, gesturing dramatically to the fleeing crowd. "Look at what you are doing. You are terrifying our guests. You are ruining a beautiful, sacred celebration. We are a respectable family, and we will not be treated like common criminals by the hired help. Marcus stood perfectly still, letting the trio of delusional narcissists exhaust themselves. He had dealt with angry, entitled clients before, but he knew the specific context of this situation. He knew exactly what Jamal had done to his own mother, and he knew exactly whose signature had been forged. He watched Elaine defend the son who had just secretly bankrupted her, and a flicker of genuine pity briefly crossed his stoic features before his expression hardened again. "I want to speak to the person in charge," Elaine demanded, her voice echoing shrilly across the emptying ballroom. "I will not speak to a security guard. Bring me the general manager. Better yet, bring me the owner of this establishment. I want the owner standing right here, right now. I am going to make sure the press hears about this. I am going to ruin the reputation of Lumina Estates forever." Jamal nodded vigorously, emboldened by his mother's unwavering defense. "That is right," Jamal chimed in, crossing his arms over his cheap velvet tuxedo. "Go get the owner. Let us see what the owner has to say about you terrorizing paying customers. Go get them right now." The few guests who had lingered near the exits stopped to watch the confrontation. The fraternity brothers and sorority sisters held their breath, waiting to see if Jamal's aggressive bluff would actually work. They were waiting for the mysterious wealthy owner of Lumina Estates to come rushing out of an office, profusely apologizing for the misunderstanding and offering free champagne to smooth things over. Marcus looked at Elaine, whose face was red with exertion. He looked at Tiffany, who was wiping away a tear that threatened to ruin her heavy contouring. Finally, he looked dead into Jamal's eyes. The head of security did not look intimidated. He did not look worried about his job or the venue's reputation. Instead, Marcus did something that completely unsettled them. He smiled. It was a slow, knowing smirk that radiated absolute terrifying confidence. "You want to speak to the owner?" Marcus asked, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the remaining murmurs in the room. "Yes," Jamal demanded, thrusting his chin in the air. "Right now." Marcus slowly raised his hand and pointed directly over Jamal's shoulder, aiming straight down the center aisle, toward the grand double doors where I had been standing in the shadows waiting for my cue. "Well, that is very convenient," Marcus said, the smirk growing wider. "Because she is right behind you." Every head in the ballroom snapped toward the grand double doors at the exact same moment. The heavy brass handles were pushed open by two of my security guards, allowing me to step out of the shadows of the hallway and directly into the blinding clinical glare of the emergency fluorescent lights. I did not look like the pathetic, banished sister they had forced onto a rusted metal chair by the urinals. I did not look like a struggling caterer. I looked exactly like what I was. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, and I had come to collect. I stood at the threshold for a brief second, letting the sheer shock of my presence wash over the crowd of 300 elite guests. I was no longer carrying a small silk clutch. Instead, gripped firmly in my right hand, was a thick manila folder containing every single piece of forged documentation my brother had used to orchestrate this massive lie. I squared my shoulders, smoothed the front of my emerald green silk dress, and began to walk. As I moved down the center aisle, the crowd naturally parted for me like the Red Sea. The corporate investors, the fraternity brothers, and the sorority sisters scrambled to get out of my way, their eyes wide with disbelief. I walked past the premium family tables. Great Aunt Denise and Aunt Beatrice stared at me with their mouths hanging wide open, their previous whispers of pity completely obliterated by the undeniable aura of authority radiating from my every step. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the pristine marble floor, the sharp, deliberate sound echoing through the cavernous, silent room like the ticking of a bomb about to detonate. As I reached the edge of the dance floor, the true shift in power became undeniably visible to everyone present. The venue staff, who had been instructed by Marcus to pull back to the perimeter of the room, did not cower or run from the angry guests. Instead, as I walked past them, the bartenders, the waitstaff, and the floor managers all immediately stopped what they were doing. They stood up perfectly straight, clasped their hands in front of them, and bowed their heads respectfully. "Good evening, boss," the senior floor manager said clearly, his voice carrying through the quiet ballroom. Good evening, Ms. Charmaine Julian, the server, who had discovered me sitting by the bathroom earlier, added with a proud, vindicated smile. I offered them a brief, acknowledging nod without breaking my stride. I stepped up onto the polished oak dance floor, joining Marcus and his security lieutenants. I was now standing face to face with the trio of toxic narcissists who had made my entire existence a living hell. Jamal was completely frozen, his arms, which had been aggressively crossed over his chest just moments ago, now hung limply at his sides. His brain was visibly misfiring, desperately trying to reconcile the image of his supposedly worthless sister with the absolute reverence she was receiving from the venue staff. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the harsh emergency lights. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Next to him, Tiffany looked as though she had just been slapped across the face. Her jaw had literally dropped open. Her eyes darted frantically between my face, the manila folder in my hand, and the imposing security guards flanking me. The narrative she had constructed, the story, where she was the wealthy, triumphant bride, taking pity on her impoverished sister-in-law, was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of her eyes. It was my mother, Elaine, who finally broke the suffocating silence. She stepped forward, her custom fascinator trembling slightly as she pointed a manicured finger at me. She was still desperately trying to cling to her authority, still trying to cast me in the role of the disruptive, jealous child. Charmaine Elaine stammered, her voice lacking its usual sharp, commanding edge. "What are you doing? Why are you walking in here like this? Why did that waiter just call you boss? Tell this security guard to turn the lights back on and stop this ridiculous prank immediately. You are ruining your brother's wedding." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I stepped right up to the edge of the VIP table, looking past my mother and staring directly into Jamal's terrified, wide eyes. I let the silence stretch for another painful second, forcing him to feel the full, crushing weight of his impending doom. "I am not playing a prank." "Mom?" I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying an icy resonance that demanded absolute attention from every single person in the room. "And I cannot tell my security team to turn the lights back on because this event has been officially canceled by the ownership." I raised the thick manila folder and dropped it onto the glass surface of the VIP table with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound made Jamal flinch violently. "They call me Boss Jamal." I continued, my eyes locked onto his because I own Lumina Estates. "You are standing inside my building. You are drinking my champagne. You are dancing on my floor. And about 15 minutes ago, my chief financial officer called me to report that the cashier's check you used to pay for this venue just bounced. It is completely fraudulent." The words hit the room with the force of a physical shockwave. A chorus of loud gasps erupted from the remaining guests. The church aunties clutched their chests in horror. The fraternity brothers recoiled, stepping physically away from Jamal as if his sudden revealed poverty was a contagious disease. Jamal shook his head rapidly, a desperate, breathless sound escaping his throat. "No," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for any possible escape route. "No, that is impossible. You are a caterer. You dropped out of school. You do not own this place. This is a lie. This is just some sick, jealous lie because you could never be as successful as me." I offered him a cold, razor-thin smile. "Did you really think I dropped out of university to scrub pans, Jamal? I dropped out to acquire commercial real estate. I spent the last 10 years building an empire while you spent the last 10 years building a fake Instagram aesthetic and drowning yourself in debt. I kept my name off the public corporate documents because I valued my privacy. But I assure you every single brick in this building belongs to me." Tiffany let out a high-pitched, hysterical noise. She grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his cheap velvet tuxedo, shaking him violently. "Jamal, tell me she is lying." Tiffany shrieked, her voice echoing painfully off the crystal chandeliers above us. "Tell me you paid for this. Tell me you are a senior director. Tell me you have the money." Jamal could not even look at his new wife. He stared down at the manila folder sitting on the glass table, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. He knew that the game was entirely over. Elaine stepped between us, her face a mask of desperate denial. "Charmaine, stop this right now," she commanded, though her voice was trembling uncontrollably. "You are confused. Jamal is a wealthy executive. He paid for this. If there is a problem with the check, it is just a simple bank error. Do not do this to your family in front of all these people." Family. I repeated, testing the word on my tongue as if it left a bitter taste. "You told me to put on a catering uniform so I would not embarrass you, Mom. You let him stick me in a rusted folding chair by the urinals because I supposedly did not fit the demographic. You call that family?" I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of the manila folder. I tapped my manicured fingernails against the thick paper. "A simple bank error does not result in a bounced check for $150,000. Mom," I stated clearly, ensuring the entire room could hear the exact dollar amount of Jamal's failure. "A simple bank error does not require the intervention of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. And a simple bank error certainly does not involve identity theft and the total liquidation of a widow's retirement fund." Elaine froze. The blood drained from her face so fast I thought she might actually collapse onto the marble floor. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air. The mention of her retirement fund had finally pierced through her armor of denial. What Elaine whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing silence of the room. "What are you talking about? What retirement fund?" I looked at my mother, feeling a strange mixture of profound pity and absolute vindication. I looked back at Jamal, whose eyes were pleading with me to stop begging me silently not to expose the darkest depths of his betrayal. But I had no mercy left to give. They had demanded a public spectacle, and I was going to deliver the grand finale. I flipped open the manila folder, preparing to unleash the absolute undeniable truth upon the room. I reached out and took the microphone from Marcus's hand. The cold metal felt heavy and grounding against my palm. I brought it to my lips, the speakers emitting a faint, sharp hum that commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every single person left in the ballroom. The room was so quiet that the sound of a pin dropping would have echoed like a gunshot. I looked down at the documents illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of the emergency fluorescent lights, and then I looked up at the crowd. My brother Jamal has built his entire adult life on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, I announced, my voice steady, ringing with undeniable authority. You all know him as a senior financial director. You know him as a wealthy, successful corporate executive who was generous enough to invite you to a $250,000 wedding. But the man standing before you today is a fraud. I pulled the first document from the folder and held it up. It was a printed termination letter. Jamal has been completely unemployed for the last 8 months, I stated clearly, letting the words sink in. And he did not resign to pursue better opportunities. He was fired from his firm. He was terminated for corporate embezzlement and gross financial mismanagement. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. The corporate investors who had lingered near the exits immediately turned their backs and practically sprinted out the doors, terrified of being associated with an admitted embezzler. Jamal's fraternity brothers, the men who had been cheering him on just 20 minutes ago, physically backed away from him. They looked at him as if he had suddenly contracted a lethal disease, their expressions morphing from admiration to utter disgust. "Shut up!" Jamal suddenly screamed, his voice cracking wildly. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched desperately, trying to snatch the microphone and the folder from my grasp. He never even made it within 3 feet of me. Marcus and one of his security lieutenants moved with terrifying speed. Marcus planted a massive hand firmly against Jamal's chest, shoving him backward with such force that Jamal stumbled and crashed hard onto the polished oak dance floor. He sprawled out in his cheap velvet tuxedo, gasping for air, completely emasculated in front of his new wife and his entire social circle. "Stay exactly where you are," Marcus commanded, his hand resting casually near the radio on his belt. I did not even flinch. I did not step back. I simply turned my gaze toward my mother. Elaine was standing frozen, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her expensive designer clutch. Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen her display before. "Mom, you wanted to know about your retirement fund," I asked, my voice dropping to a softer yet infinitely more lethal tone. "You wanted to know how your golden boy paid for this extravagant venue." I pulled the bank statements from the folder. The papers rustled loudly in the microphone. I read them out loud, ensuring the church aunties sitting at the family tables heard every single syllable. On March 12th, a wire transfer of $50,000 was initiated from your joint account. On May 2nd, another $30,000 was withdrawn. On July 15th, a final withdrawal of $20,000 cleared the bank. Elaine's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the VIP table to keep herself upright, her knuckles turning completely white. "Jamal drained your entire 401k to pay the non-refundable deposits for this wedding," I told her, delivering the kill shot without a shred of hesitation. "He bled your accounts dry. You have zero savings left, Mom. You are completely undeniably bankrupt. The money Dad worked his entire life to save for your care is gone, spent on imported orchids and vintage champagne." "No," Elaine whispered, her voice a fragile, broken sound. She shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her perfect makeup. "No, Jamal would never do that to me. He promised he was investing it. He promised." "He lied to you," I replied coldly, "just like he lied to everyone else in this room. But draining your life savings was not enough to cover the full cost of this luxury package. He still needed $150,000 to pay the final balance." I pulled the final document from the folder, holding up the credit application so the police detectives waiting near the exits could see it clearly. Because he is unemployed and drowning in massive debt, no legitimate bank would ever issue him a line of credit. So he needed a guarantor with perfect credit and substantial assets. He needed someone he thought was too stupid to ever find out. I pointed directly at Jamal, who was still cowering on the floor, breathing heavily under the watchful eyes of my security team. "To pay for the rest of this wedding, your perfect son forged my signature on a federal loan document. He committed identity theft to secure a line of credit, fully intending to let the check bounce and leave me legally responsible for his massive debt. He tried to ruin my financial future to buy himself one night of fake glory." The absolute silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and utterly devastating. The facade was not just cracked, it was completely obliterated, ground into dust under the heel of my designer shoe. The first person to fully break was Tiffany. She had been standing off to the side, staring at Jamal with an expression of dawning, horrific comprehension. She had married this man solely for his money, his status, and the lavish lifestyle he had promised her. She had endured the stress of planning this wedding, she had insulted me, and she had alienated her own friends. All because she believed she was securing a future as a wealthy socialite. Now she realized she was legally bound to an unemployed bankrupt felon. Tiffany let out a scream that sounded like a feral animal. It was a shrill, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. She reached up and violently ripped the custom-beaded veil from her hair, tearing out several bobby pins and a chunk of her own hair in the process. She threw the ruined tulle fabric directly into Jamal's face. "You lied to me," Tiffany shrieked, her voice echoing painfully through the ballroom. "You disgusting, broke loser. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me we were buying a mansion in Buckhead next month." Jamal scrambled backward on the floor, holding his hands up defensively. "Tiff, baby, please, just let me explain." He begged, his arrogant bravado completely replaced by pathetic whimpering. "I can fix this. I have investments pending. I can get the money." "You do not have a single dime," she screamed, stepping forward and kicking him sharply in the shin with her pointed heel. Jamal yelped in pain. Tiffany turned around, grabbed her half-full crystal flute of vintage champagne from the table, and hurled it forcefully at the floor near his feet. The expensive glass shattered into hundreds of pieces, sending champagne splattering across his velvet tuxedo. She held up her left hand, her fingers trembling with fury as she stared at the massive, glittering ring on her finger. A ring he claimed cost $40,000. "If you lied about your job and you stole your mother's money to pay for this wedding," she practically hyperventilated, her eyes widening in horrific realization. "Then what the hell is on my finger?" She yanked the ring off her finger with vicious force. She marched over to one of the marble pillars and scraped the stone hard against the surface. It left a massive cloudy scratch on the supposed diamond. "It is fake," Tiffany wailed, holding the ruined stone up for her sorority sisters to see. "It is cubic zirconia. My entire life is a joke. I married a fraud." Tiffany burst into loud, ugly sobs, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. She turned and sprinted down the center aisle, pushing past the stunned security guards and running out the main doors, completely abandoning the wedding, the venue, and her new husband. As Tiffany fled the room, Elaine finally collapsed. Her legs completely gave out beneath her, and she fell heavily into one of the padded chairs at the VIP table. She let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound born from the sudden violent destruction of her entire worldview. The son she had worshipped, the boy she had protected and elevated above all else, was a thief who had stolen her future. And the daughter, she had banished the girl she had shoved by the toilets and handed a catering uniform, was the multimillionaire owner of the building holding her fate. Elaine looked up at me, her face a mask of complete devastation. Her custom fascinator had fallen off, landing unceremoniously on the floor next to the shattered champagne glass. She reached a trembling hand out toward me, her eyes pleading for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. "Charmaine, please," Elaine begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, you have to stop this. He is your brother. He made a terrible mistake, but we are family. You have the money. You own this place. Please, just pay for this. Cover the check. Do not let them take him away. Save us, Charmaine. Please." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had made my childhood a prison of inadequacy. I felt the heavy gaze of the church aunties watching from the back, waiting to see if I would fulfill my traditional role and sacrifice myself for the sake of the family image. I looked at Jamal, who was still cowering on the floor, looking up at me with desperate, pathetic hope. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my heart. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was absolute, unshakable clarity. I had spent 35 years begging for a seat at their table, and now they were begging for a crumb from mine. I looked down at my mother with absolute ice in my veins. "Family," I repeated, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of empathy. "Family puts you at the table, Mom. Family defends you. Family protects you." I pointed toward the back of the room, toward the rusted metal chair sitting alone in the dark hallway near the restrooms. "Family does not stick you on a rusted folding chair by the urinals and tell you to be grateful for the pity. You chose your family today when you handed me that catering uniform. You made your bed with your golden boy. Now lie in it." I turned to Marcus, who was standing tall and ready. "Call the detectives in," I ordered. "Hand over the documents and let them process the arrest. I want my building cleared in exactly 10 minutes. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on my mother's wailing and my brother's sobbing. I walked proudly down the center aisle, the heavy doors opening before me, leaving the toxic ruins of my past behind forever. As I reached the heavy brass handles of the grand double doors, the piercing wail of police sirens finally shattered the quiet Georgia night. The sound started as a distant scream and rapidly escalated into an overwhelming roar, vibrating through the thick glass of the lobby windows. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness outside, casting wild, rotating shadows across the pristine marble floors of Lumina Estates. The cavalry had arrived. I stopped just inside the main entrance, watching as 4 marked Atlanta Police Department cruisers screeched to a halt right in the VIP drop-off zone. Marcus stepped up beside me, his hand resting securely on the radio at his belt. He gave a brief, professional nod to the 2 security guards stationed at the front entrance, signaling them to push the glass doors wide open. The cool night air rushed into the stifling lobby, bringing with it the static chatter of police radios. Leading the charge was a tall, broad-shouldered detective in a sharp gray suit, holding a gold badge up for my security team to see. Behind him were 4 uniformed officers, their expressions grim and strictly focused on the task at hand. I stepped forward to meet the detective halfway across the lobby, holding the thick manila folder tightly against my side. "Detective Reynolds, I presume?" I asked, my voice calm and collected, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos unfolding just a few dozen yards behind me in the ballroom. "Yes, ma'am," the detective replied, his sharp eyes scanning the lobby before locking on to me. "Your chief financial officer, David, gave me a thorough briefing over the phone on his way over. He said you have a suspect actively on the premises who has committed federal wire fraud and identity theft." I extended my hand, offering him the manila folder. "I do," I stated firmly. "The suspect is the groom. His name is Jamal. He is currently located in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by my security personnel. Everything you need to establish probable cause and make an immediate arrest is right inside this folder. You will find the fraudulent cashier's check for $150,000, the forged federal loan application containing my stolen signature, and the bank statements proving he liquidated an elderly woman's retirement account to pay the initial venue deposits." Detective Reynolds opened the folder, quickly flipping through the high-resolution scans and the forged signatures. His professional demeanor hardened as he processed the sheer volume of financial crimes meticulously documented on those pages. He closed the folder, tucking it securely under his arm. "This is incredibly thorough, Ms. Charmaine," he said, giving me a respectful nod. "We will take it from here. Please remain in the lobby while my officers secure the suspect." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the open double doors of the ballroom. "He is all yours, Detective." The officers marched down the carpeted hallway with heavy, synchronized footsteps. I followed at a safe distance, standing just outside the ballroom doors, to witness the final act of this tragedy. The emergency fluorescent lights were still blazing, casting their harsh, unforgiving glare over the ruined reception. The corporate investors had already fled, but a large crowd of family members, fraternity brothers and sorority sisters, remained frozen in place, trapped by a morbid fascination with the unfolding disaster. When the uniformed police officers marched onto the polished oak dance floor, a collective gasp swept through the remaining guests. The reality of the situation had finally crossed the line from a dramatic family dispute to a severe criminal consequence. Jamal was still sitting on the floor where Marcus had shoved him, his expensive velvet tuxedo covered in the sticky, spilled remnants of vintage champagne. When he saw the police officers approaching him, the very last remnants of his arrogant alpha male facade completely evaporated. The wealthy corporate executive vanished, replaced entirely by a terrified, broke fraudster facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Jamal scrambled backward on the floor, his designer shoes slipping uselessly against the polished oak. "No, wait, please," Jamal cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "You do not understand. This is a misunderstanding. I did not mean to steal anything. I was going to pay it back. I have investments. You have to believe me." Detective Reynolds stood over him, entirely unmoved by the pathetic display. "Jamal, you are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny," the detective announced, his voice booming over the silence of the room. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." "I cannot go to jail," Jamal wailed, tears streaming down his face. He looked frantically toward the head table where Elaine was still slumped in her chair, paralyzed by shock. "Mom, do something. Call a lawyer. Tell them I did not mean to do it. Tell Charmaine to drop the charges. Please, Mom, do not let them take me." But Elaine did not move. She did not speak. The woman who had spent her entire life shielding her golden child from every single consequence of his actions finally had nothing left to give. Her retirement was gone. Her pride was destroyed. She simply sat there, staring blankly at the floor, looking 20 years older than she had just an hour prior. She was completely broken by the realization that her blind favoritism had created the very monster currently begging at her feet. When Jamal realized his mother was not going to save him, he tried to resist. He weakly pushed one of the advancing officers away, a foolish, instinctual panic response. It was the worst mistake he could have possibly made. Within seconds, two officers grabbed him by the shoulders, forcefully hauling him up from the floor. They spun him around, slamming him face first against one of the marble pillars holding up the balcony. "Stop resisting," an officer barked, pressing his forearm against Jamal's back. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly through the ballroom. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of accountability. It was the sound of justice finally catching up to a man who believed he was entirely above the law. The officers pulled him away from the pillar, turning him around to face the crowd. Jamal's custom velvet tuxedo was torn at the shoulder, covered in white dust from the marble, and reeking of cheap panic and spilled alcohol. His face was red and swollen from crying, his perfect haircut completely ruined. As Detective Reynolds began reading Jamal his Miranda rights, a fascinating phenomenon occurred within the crowd. The initial shock wore off, replaced instantly by the ruthless performative nature of modern social media culture. The fraternity brothers who had toasted to Jamal's success, the sorority sisters who had envied Tiffany's apparent wealth, and even some of the younger cousins sitting at the family tables reached into their pockets and purses. One by one, the glowing screens of smartphones lit up the perimeter of the dance floor. They were recording him. The people he had stolen $250,000 to impress were now treating him like a viral spectacle. The camera flashes fired in rapid succession, a cruel modern replacement for the crystal chandeliers that had been turned off. They were capturing every single second of his humiliating perp walk. The perfect, luxurious wedding aesthetic he had desperately tried to curate was now permanently documented as a chaotic, pathetic crime scene. Jamal tried to lower his head, trying to hide his tear-stained face from the relentless cameras, but the officers held his arms tightly, forcing him to walk upright. As they marched him down the center aisle, he had to pass right by the rusted metal folding chair sitting near the restrooms. The chair he had forced me to sit in. The chair he claimed was the only place I belonged. He looked at the rusted chair, and then he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, flanked by my security team. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the cold, detached expression of a chief executive officer observing the removal of a trespasser from her property. Charmaine. I am sorry. Jamal sobbed as the officers dragged him past me into the lobby. I am so sorry. Please just talk to the police. Tell them it is a family matter. Do not do this to me. I did not answer him. I let the silence be my final response. The police officers marched him out through the grand glass doors and shoved him into the back of a waiting cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping him in the dark cage of his own making. With Jamal secured in the police vehicle, I turned my attention away from the flashing lights and walked out toward the VIP parking area where my Maybach was waiting. But as I crossed the pristine gravel driveway, I caught sight of the final, pathetic act of this tragedy playing out near the guest parking lot. It was Tiffany. She had sprinted out of the building several minutes ago, but she had not gone far. She was standing under a street lamp, shivering in the cool night air, furiously typing on her smartphone. Her heavy contouring makeup was completely destroyed, running down her face in dark, muddy streaks from her hysterical crying. She looked absolutely unhinged. A sleek white SUV pulled up aggressively to the curb next to her. It was driven by one of her bridesmaids, a woman who had clearly decided to abandon the sinking ship alongside the bride. Tiffany grabbed the heavy beaded skirt of her cheap replica gown, yanking it up aggressively so she could climb into the passenger seat. As she stepped up into the vehicle, she paused. She looked back toward the venue, watching as the police cruiser holding her new husband pulled away from the curb, its sirens wailing into the night. Tiffany did not look sad. She did not look like a heartbroken wife whose husband was just taken to jail. She looked furiously indignant. She had married for money that did not exist, and she was cutting her losses with ruthless efficiency. She reached into the back of the SUV, grabbed the torn remnants of her custom veil, and hurled it forcefully into a muddy puddle on the edge of the driveway. She slammed the car door shut, and the SUV sped off into the night tires, squealing against the asphalt. Tiffany was gone, abandoning her fraudulent marriage before the reception was even officially supposed to end. I stood in the quiet parking lot watching the taillights of the SUV disappear around the corner. The flashing red and blue police lights faded into the distance, taking the golden child of the family straight to a federal holding cell. The grand $250,000 wedding had been completely dismantled, erased by a single phone call and a stack of undeniable receipts. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, feeling a profound, absolute sense of freedom settle over my entire being. The toxic ruins of my family were safely contained behind me. The purge was officially complete. I walked back through the heavy glass doors of Lumina Estates. The overwhelming chaos of the evening had finally dissolved into a heavy, echoing silence. The 300 elite guests had completely vanished, leaving behind a wasteland of abandoned silk napkins, half-empty crystal champagne flutes, and scattered white orchid petals on the pristine marble floor. I moved slowly across the lobby and stepped back into the grand ballroom. The harsh, clinical glare of the emergency fluorescent lights was still blazing brightly, illuminating the sheer emptiness of the massive space. At the center of the room, sitting entirely alone at the head VIP table, was my mother. Elaine had not moved an inch since the police hauled her golden child away in handcuffs. She sat slumped in her padded chair, her hands resting limply on the glass table next to her ruined custom fascinator. She was staring blankly at the far wall, her face stained with dark streaks of mascara and the absolute devastation of a woman who had just realized her entire life was a lie. Her bank accounts were empty. Her retirement fund was completely gone. The son she had worshipped, protected, and elevated above me had sacrificed her financial security without a second thought. I stood a few yards away, watching her for a long moment. She did not look up. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely no obligation to rescue her. I turned my back and walked straight toward the catering kitchen. The kitchen was quiet, but fully staffed. My culinary team, led by Executive Chef Thomas, was standing by the massive stainless steel prep tables, waiting for my orders. They had prepared $250,000 worth of gourmet food for a reception that was never going to happen. Trays of perfectly seared filet mignon, buttery lobster tails, truffle-infused asparagus, and an elaborate 7-tier wedding cake sat completely untouched. "Chef," I said, addressing the room, "I want you to grab every single piece of Tupperware and commercial packaging we have in the supply closet. Portion out all of this food right now. I want every bartender, every server, every security guard, and every member of the cleaning crew to take as much of this home as they can carry. Whatever is left over after our staff is fed. Package it up and have the refrigerated transport vans deliver it to the downtown women's shelter first thing in the morning. Not a single bite of this goes to waste." The staff broke into genuine relieved smiles. Julian, the server, who had found me sitting by the restroom hours earlier, stepped forward and gave me a respectful nod. "Thank you, Ms. Charmaine," he said softly. I watched them spring into action, laughing and sharing the lavish feast that Jamal had tried to steal. It was a beautiful sight. True wealth was not about hoarding resources or putting other people down to elevate yourself. It was about having the power to provide for the people who actually respected you. 1 week later, the legal reality of Jamal's actions crashed down on him with the full weight of the federal justice system. He was brought before a judge for his initial arraignment. Because he had committed interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and possessed absolutely no financial assets or legitimate employment, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk. Jamal was denied bail entirely. He was sent directly back to a federal holding cell to await a trial that would undoubtedly result in a lengthy prison sentence. Tiffany had already filed for an annulment, claiming she was a victim of his fraudulent misrepresentation, legally severing herself from the mess before the ink on their marriage license was even dry. Meanwhile, Elaine was facing her own catastrophic reality. Without her retirement savings, she had absolutely no way to pay the massive mortgage on the sprawling colonial house in Fairfield. The bank had issued a formal notice of default, and the foreclosure process was looming just weeks away. My smartphone vibrated on my desk, the screen illuminating with a blocked caller ID. It was her, again. I listened to the voicemail out of pure curiosity. "Charmaine," her voice shook thick with tears and absolute desperation. "Please pick up the phone. I have nowhere else to go. The bank is taking the house. Jamal's public defender says he is going to prison. I am so sorry for everything. I was wrong. Please, you have so much room in your home. Let me stay with you. We are family. We are..." "You cannot just leave your own mother on the street." I sat back in my leather chair listening to the recording play out. There was a time when hearing my mother cry would have sent me rushing to her side, eager to prove my worth. desperate to earn the love she so freely gave to my brother. But that version of me was gone, left behind on a rusted metal chair by a bathroom door. I felt no anger, no sadness, and no guilt. I simply picked up the phone, pressed the delete button, and permanently blocked her number from ever reaching my device again. I stood up and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office at the Lumina Estates corporate headquarters. The glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out before me, bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. The view was breathtaking, a daily reminder of the empire I had built with my own two hands. David, my chief financial officer, stepped into the office holding a sleek leather folio. He walked over to my polished mahogany desk and opened the folder, presenting a stack of legal documents. "Here is the final contract for the acquisition of the new Buckhead property," Ms. Charmaine David said, handing me a heavy gold fountain pen. "Everything has been fully vetted by the legal team." I took the pen, skimming the details of the multi-million-dollar deal. I signed my name at the bottom of the page with smooth, confident strokes. My signature, my power, my future. I handed the folder back to David, who offered a warm smile of congratulations before stepping out of the office, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the city below. I looked out at the horizon, thinking about the long, painful journey that had brought me to this exact moment. I turned away from the window, looking directly forward, as if speaking to anyone who had ever been made to feel like they were not enough. When toxic people try to assign you a seat in the back, do not argue with them. Do not cry, and do not beg for their approval. Just buy the whole building and evict them. Family is an action, not a bloodline, and my table, it is fully booked.